On behalf of the Center for Chinese Studies here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, I would like to welcome everyone to our Fall 2024 CCS webinar series. And today's session featured as a faculty dialogue on the topic of the crucial role of regional governments in national constitutional development, a comparative historical study of China and the US. Our invited guest speaker today is Professor Bing Ning from the Law School of Peking University, who is joining us live from Beijing, where it is actually 6 a.m. in the morning. So thank you, Professor Bing, for getting up so early for us. He will be introduced by our moderator today, Professor Charles Booth, from the William S. Richardson School of Law here at UH Manoa after these announcements. My name is Mingbao Yu, and I'm currently serving as the CCS Director. My home department is East Asian Languages and Literature, where I research and teach 20th century Chinese literature, film, and culture. I would also like to take this opportunity here to introduce the CCS staff that includes Associate Director Dr. Ni Zhang and Academic Support Staff Mr. Jesse Shan, who both will monitor the chat room and assist with any logistical queries you may have about today's session. Please note that we are recording today's session so it can be uploaded to our YouTube channel, where you can also find previously recorded CCS webinar sessions in case you missed them. Our full CCS webinar program flyer for this semester can be found on our CCS website. If you click on your chat room now, you see the links for our CCS YouTube channel and CCS website displayed there. Today's session is also co-sponsored by Pacific Asian Legal Studies, International and Comparative Law, the Institute of Asian Pacific Business Law, and the William S. Richardson School of Law here at UH Manoa. We would like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors for their kind support. Before I proceed to introduce today's moderator, Professor Charles Booth, allow me to quickly go over some procedure reminders for those who are unfamiliar with our webinar format. Feel free to use the chat room for posting any technical and other queries you may have about today's session, but only use the Q&A tool for submitting your comments and questions to the speakers, which will be answered during the Q&A portion of our session. We kindly ask that you do not wait until the last minute to post your comments. Ask no more than 2 questions, keep them concise, so that everyone can be accommodated within the 30 minutes we have allocated to the Q&A session. As much as possible, questions will be answered in the order they have been submitted, but we might also synthesize or group together similar questions in order to make the best use of our time. We further reserve the right to dismiss comments and questions that are not relevant or civil in tone. After today's session, you will receive a brief survey, and we would greatly appreciate your constructive feedback. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Charles Booth, who is the Michael J. Marks Distinguished Professor of Business Law and the Director of the Institute of Asia-Pacific Business Law at the William S. Richardson School of Law here at UH Manoa. He received his BA from Yale University and his JD from Harvard Law School. After practicing on Wall Street, he first taught at Richardson School of Law from 1986 to 1989, and then taught at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong from 1989 to 2005, before he returned to UH Manoa in 2006. He is the leading expert on comparative and cross-border insolvency and commercial law, and his research especially focuses on Chinese and Hong Kong bankruptcy law. Currently, he also serves on the executive committee of the Center for Chinese Studies. So without further ado, let me turn over to Professor Charles Booth.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. What I'd like to do now is introduce our speaker, Professor Bin Ling from Peking University Law School. At the law school, Professor Ling is also a PhD supervisor, and he's the director of the Center for Law and Social Governance Studies at Peking U. He has 2 degrees from Peking University, both an LLB and a PhD in law, and he also has 2 degrees from Yale Law School, an LLM, and a recently awarded JSD. His main research interests include legal theory, comparative law, constitutional history, law and social sciences, and law and policy. For over a decade, he served as vice president of the adjudication and an adjudication committee member and a judge at the People's Court in Beijing. So he has judicial experience as well, which is an interesting combination for an academic, and he's also been a visiting scholar at several law schools, including Cornell Law School, Tilburg Law School, here at the Center for Chinese Studies, and he was here this summer for several months doing some research, as well as Columbia Law School and Yale Law School. The discussant today will be Professor Carol Peterson, one of my colleagues at the Richardson School of Law. Professor Peterson received her BA from the University of Chicago and her JD from Harvard Law School. And then when she was in Hong Kong, she also received a postgraduate certificate in the law of the PRC from the University of Hong Kong. Professor Peterson practiced on Wall Street and elsewhere in New York for many years, and then spent 17 years teaching in Hong Kong at both the City University and at the University of Hong Kong. She is now full-time at the law school here at Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii, where she is the Cades Foundation professor. And with those introductions, I will now turn the microphone over to Professor Bin Ling.
Aloha. Can you hear me? I just want to make sure it works now. Good, okay. Aloha. First of all, I would like to take a moment to thank those wonderful people who have helped make this search and presentation a success. Professors Mingbao Yu, Mark Levin, Carl Peterson, Charles Booth, and Rich, Daniel, and Stephen. All offered invaluable guidance and generous support. Their insights and feedback were crucial in shaping this project, and I truly appreciate their contributions. I also want to thank several institutions and programs that offer vital support during this research. This includes the PKU and the UHM Visiting Scholar Exchange Program, Center for Chinese Studies, Pacific Asian Legal Studies Program, Institute of Asian Pacific Business Law at the University of Hawaii. Their resources and support have been essential, and I truly appreciate. Mahalo. A popular framework for comparing China and the US focuses on structural difference in their constitutional systems, with the US seen as a decentralized federal state and China as a centralized unitary state. However, this presentation will show that when we look at it through the lens of, I call it polycentrism instead of federalism, China and the US actually shared significant similarities in their constitutional spatial structures. To understand this distinction, we can draw an analogy with the composition of Van Gogh paintings. When we categorize Van Gogh's paintings by the arrangement of their central image, we notice two distinctively different styles. One category, like in the church at ours, is distinctively monocentric. Here, the church is in the main focus, taking center stage in the composition. The sky, road, grassland, and female figures support the central image, highlighting the church's dominance in the painting. This compositional style predominates in works such as portraits of Dr. Gatchett and the self-portrait series, where the subject serves as a central figure, and the night cafe, which Van Gogh described to his brother in his letter as having a blood red and dull yellow room with a green billiard table in the center. This monocentric style is in stark contrast to the other category, which is polycentric. In the sunflower series, for instance, there isn't a single flower at the center. Instead, multiple flowers together create a polycentric arrangement. This style is also evident in Vincent's bedroom, the potato eaters, and the starry night. In the starry night, the church from the church at hours is reduced to just one part of the village. It's set against the night sky with the shining moon and stars. The church is still important, but if we only appreciate the church and overlook the starry night, we risk thinking the church is the center, even the only thing of the Van Gogh universe. We see a similarity in our understanding of the US and China and their historical changes. Washington, D.C. and Beijing were and are significant, but if we focus only on them, we miss an important point. Each capital is just one location on the national map. The similarities between the US and China arise from their common background of polycentric constitutional spaces and their transformations. Although current discussions often highlight the differences between the US and China, there's a notable similarity of the transformation of their spatial constitutional spaces in their early republics. China's modern history started in Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Nanjing, and Shanghai, rather than in Beijing. And the United States started in different cities and different states. Both republics experienced an initial founding moment based on a polycentric revolution, accumulating in a brief period of monocentric constitution that established their respective national governments. But their monocentric constitutions were all short-lived. Beneath the nominally national government, both nations swiftly reverted to a persistent state of polycentric constitution. And ultimately, neither country avoided national disunion and civil war. However, the post-war era in both nations witnessed polycentric reconstruction and in a long domestic peace and global assistance. these cities in the map are the super cities which play a crucial role in Chinese history. For example, the Taiping War, which was the first civil war from 1850 to 1864, began in Guangzhou and Hong Kong. A central government later formed in Nanjing, challenging the Beijing government both militarily and constitutionally. Shanghai subsequently played a crucial role in the conflict between those two sides. The 1911 revolution was the result of a constitutionalist agreement among these polycentric super cities like Wuhan, Nanjing, and Beijing. The independence declaration by 14 South provinces and their arrangements for Republican revolution in Nanjing triggered the fall of the imperial government in Beijing. Wuhan, Shanghai, and Nanjing were crucial revolutionary centers during this time. Nanjing was selected for the provisional central government, even though there were conservative attempts to shift it to Beijing. And the founding of the United States and its constitutional making resulted from polycentric collaboration. The original 13 colonies, particular Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York, were leaders in the independence movement and national building. Boston was key in relaying resistance against British rule. Philadelphia served as the de facto capital, hosting the Continental Congresses and the Constitutional Conventions. New York City was the first capital under the new Constitution. Virginia, called the mother of presidents, had a major impact on early leadership, providing 4 of the first 5 presidents. Smaller states like Rhode Island also played vital roles in the debates over representation and ratification of the Constitution. Both countries' polycentric revolutions resulted in short-lived monocentric national governments. Yet these central governments only held nominal monocentric status because of emerging cross-regional constitutional polycenters. In China, after the 1911 revolution, the Republic of China had a brief monocentric phase lasting only about 5 years. In the United States, the former colonies also become distinct regions, each centered around different commercial and political hubs. They didn't unify into a monocentric nation just through constitutional inventions. For example, during the War of 1812, New England states met in December 1914 at Hartford Convention, one of the constitutional polycenters outside Washington, D.C., to discuss their anti-war position and even consider separatist options. Both the United States and China illustrate that constitutional politics with polycentric roots cannot be accomplished all at once. Even achieving basic consensus was remarkable. The polycentric Republican Revolution marked not the end, but the beginning of polycentric constitutional competition. Unlike their short founding moments, both republics face a lengthy period of polycentric constitution between their initial establishment and later reconstruction. The American era of polycentric constitution spanned around 40 years. It featured what Professor Lacroix refers to as the long interbellum constitution from 1815 to 1861, along with the short Civil War period from 1861 to 1865. After 1916, the Chinese Republic turned into a polycentric state. This polycentric period continued for nearly 35 years, from 1916 to 1949, featuring brief interbellum intervals and extended armed conflicts. In modern China, the constitutional structure is altered in certain supercities. All constitution-making efforts, revolutions, and regime changes happened within a fixed number of constitutional polycenters, such as Beijing, Guangzhou, and Nanjing. And however, the polycentric structure in the United States is more fluid. There were no fixed constitutional polycenters, but for example, the interbellum constitution formed flexible polycenters based on different topics. Leading states took on an important role in various issues, but no one state was crucial for everything. In contemporary U.S. constitutional developments, individual states continue to play pivotal roles in shaping national debates and policies. For example, California leads in environmental regulation. Texas shapes immigration policy, and Massachusetts influences healthcare reform, highlight the state's roles as laboratories of democracy and for national space. The constitutional tradition of multiple and mutable subject matter competition formed during the American Revolutionary and interbellum periods enabled even a state like Hawaii, often viewed as isolated and unimportant, to play a key role in the American constitutional change. The 1978 Hawaii Constitutional Convention, commonly known as the Con, marks a significant turning point in Hawaii's political and constitutional history. The Con key achievements included formal recognition of Native Hawaiian rights, the establishment of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and strong environmental protections, transforming Hawaii's government and influencing discussions on indigenous rights and environmental issues across the United States. following the mandate of the Hawaii State Constitution, which requires the electorate to vote every 10 years on whether to convene a constitutional convention. The citizens of Hawaii approached the convention in the 1976 general election. This constitutional amendment was not decided by native Hawaiians. It was the choice of all voters at that time. The 1978 Hawaiian Constitutional Convention enacted reforms that set precedents for indigenous rights and environmental stewardship, influencing broad U.S. discussion on government accountability, mutual culture, education, environmental law, and direct democracy. Crucial provisions included open government access, mandatory teaching of Hawaiian culture, expanded public trust doctrine for national resources, and the reform to initial and referendum processes, reinvigorating debates on state constitutions' roles in protecting rights beyond the U.S. Constitution. The 1978 Kong achieved several significant advancements, especially in these fields, and a key outcome was the establishment of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. However, the decisive breakthrough was not easily achieved. Compared to Hawaii's groundbreaking 1978 Kong, early state efforts to address indigenous rights had major limitations. For example, New Mexico's 1912 Constitution protected Native American voting rights and exempted Indian lands from taxation, but it lacked comprehensive measures like the OHA and the provisions for indigenous languages. Arizona's 1910 Constitution mainly focuses on disclaiming state claims to Indian lands without protecting traditional rights or cultural preservation. Alaska's 1956 Convention dealt with native land claims, but was criticized for inadequate protections and the lack of indigenous input. Montana's 1972 Constitution acknowledged Native American cultural heritage, but did not establish the specific mechanisms for cultural preservation and self-governance that Hawaii implemented. The lack of state-level offices and a strong mechanism for indigenous rights before Hawaii's 1978 Kong was due to several reasons. Native American relations were mainly handled at the under the federal level, which limited state actions. Tribes were seen as domestic dependent nations, so they usually operated outside state jurisdictions. States often views tribes as competitors for resources, not as groups that needed representation. There were not many significant state constitutional reforms before the 1960s and 1970s. Plus, the varieties of tribal nation made it hard to set up a single state office to represent all interests effectively and nationally. Many attempts to establish state-level offices with constitutional status before 1978 were limited and unsuccessful. For example, California efforts in the 1950s to create an Indian Affairs Agency were underfunded and dissolved due to opposition from the tribes and the non-native interests. In May, discussions about state-level offices for tribal affairs during the 1970s, Indian Claims Settlement Act negotiations were ultimately excluded from the final agreement. Similarly, debates around the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act included proposals for state-level representation, but were overshadowed by the federal settlement. Things stayed the same until the 1978 Hawaii Concon achieved several significant breakthroughs in addressing indigenous rights, going beyond what other states had done before. Hawaii's innovative approaches to indigenous rights have influenced other states with significant Native American populations, leading to initiatives like Alaska's establishment of the Alaska Native Language Preservation and Advisory Council in 2012. Washington State's agreements with tribes on gathering rights, and the New Mexico's creation of a cabinet-level position for preserving Native American languages in 2014. Hawaii constitutional provisions for indigenous rights spurred national legal and policy reforms, leading to the 1990 Native American Languages Act, which recognized and supported the preservation of indigenous languages. Additionally, Hawaii's model influenced the National Historic Preservation Act amendments of 1992, expanding protection for Native American cultural properties. The concept of a state agency for indigenous affairs, exemplified by OHA, have also been discussed as a model for other states and at the federal level, contributing to debates on self-determination and governance for Native American tribes. These innovations demonstrate how a state could utilize its constitutional process to address local issues while also adding to the national constitutional discussion. About half a century ago, another Kong was vital for national constitutional change. It was 1920 to 1921 Hunan Constitutional Convention. I would like to call it as Hunan Kong in this presentation. Like the Hawaii Constitutional Convention, the Hunan Kong achieved important advancements in recognizing and protecting the rights and the institutions of Native people. However, it is crucial to know that the Native Hunanese people are not considered indigenous people in the same way as Native Hawaiians or Native Americans. This comparison is based on the constitutional status of subnational governments. Just like states in the United structure, provinces act as subnational governments in modern China. Notably, this provincial state system in China originated from the Hunan Kong, which was a key moment in the development of China's government. The Hunan Kong, held in Changsha, the provincial capital of Hunan, marked a significant milestone in the establishment of provincial authority and local governance through constitutional processes. After the convention, the provincial government was elected by the province natives instead of being appointed by the central government. The convention played a key role in changing the old imperial system into a new republican system, integrating local systems into the constitution for the first time. The constitution of Hunan province, adopted in the Kong in 1922, create a provincial republican system with a provincial assembly and a provincial administration, both elected by Native people along with rights for those Native people. Without exception, all subsequent provincial and national constitutions inherited the basic framework initially establishment in the Hunan Kong. Many historians and legal scholars tend to overlook or underestimate the lasting impact of the Hunan Kong and the provincial constitutions, particularly their connection to later national constitutions. In fact, if the Hunan Kong haven't set up the new provincial system as the basic framework for local governance, the following national constitutions probably won't have recognized the provincial authority of Native people from the start. It is important to know that before the Hunan Kong, provinces, the Chinese provinces, were seen as part of the central government, not the local government. Also, a common proposal for the constitutional reform was the idea of abolishing provinces. On the one hand, the provincial systems was starting to take shape with tri-level local administrative divisions emerging within the province. However, on the other hand, this system never got constitutional recognition, recognition, and neither did county level or other local institutions. Before the Hunan Constitutional Convention, the supreme ruler of a province called the military governor and the other high-ranking officials were usually non-native elites from other provinces appointed by the central government. Looking back, the abolition of provinces and the abolition of military governors were two competing constitutional proposals. While history led to the end of the military governance systems rather than dissolving provinces, the central government at the time, led by a coalition of northern provinces, first focuses on eliminating provincial structures. Ultimately, though, the outcome was shaped by the practical effects of the Hunan Kangkang and the provincial constitutionalism movement that started and promoted by the Hunan Kangkang in 1920. Up until 1920, in the early Republic of China, provinces worked as agencies for central government. They weren't recognized as local systems. The provincial system was separated from local systems. The trend was moving towards ending the provincial system and establishing a county-based local system. The Hunan Kangkang changed the course of China's constitutional history. The Constitutional Convention in Hunan, which initiated the provincial constitutionalism movements, illustrates how a change in one province could propel a national transformation and how a single provincial capital could change a nationwide constitutional movement. The Constitutional Convention, the Constitutional Conventions in Hunan and Hawaii illustrate a common trend in countries with polycentric, revolutionary, and constitutional traditions. The national or central government often serves as a contingent neutral tool in constitutional competitions. At the same time, subnational constitutional polycentres can take on key roles in promoting national constitutional transformations. Unlike monocentric nations like France, polycentric republics such as the United States or China feature a more complex government structure. In these systems, the national or central government doesn't always possess the qualities its name implies. It is not necessarily a truly national or neutral body. Rather, the central government, the national, the central, or the federal government arises from the competing forces in polycentric constitutional competition. The poly-direction of the national, federal, or central government is mainly determined by the real distribution of power in the constitutional space. The direction often reflects the interests of the subnational faction that has the most influence over the central government. The federalist approach typically separates national and state authorities, general and local interests, and the federal and state powers. However, it has a key limitation. There's no built-in mechanism to ensure that a national or the national, federal, or central government will genuinely represent general interests or possess true national authority. This limitation is even more evident in polycentric federal or unitary systems, where various power centers make the idea of centralized or decentralized representation more complicated. This was the case in China. The main issue during the provincial constitutionalism movement of the 1920s, which triggered a new polycentric constitutional revolution with provincial constitutional making, was that Beijing government had been dominated by some northern provinces since the Republic China was established. The Beijing government did not truly represent all regions of the country. Instead, it acted mainly as a tool for a few northern provinces to surprise and attack the southern provinces. Therefore, after the republic was establishment, the southern provinces continually opposed the constitution's laws and decrees from the central government. This, in resistance, was a key factor in the shift to return to a polycentric competitive structure after the short-lived monocentric situation as a founding moment. In the United States, both state and federal powers served as political tools with varying goals. Federal power during the interbellum period, for example, didn't always promote freedom, nor did state authority consistently support racial subordination. For example, in the case Abelman versus Booth, another Booth, Wisconsin challenged federal power to assert state autonomy against the Fugitive Slave Act, only for its citizens to later fight for the Union under the banner of states' rights. The polycentric constitutional space allows subnational constitutional centers to significantly influence national constitutional transformation. In the early times of both republics, conflicts revolved around central-local relations, but in reality, they were inter-regional disputes led by constitutional polycenters during their interbellum and bellum periods. A notable example is Georgia dispossession of the Cherokee Nation territory, where the state used the federal government as a tool to undermine the rights and the interests of marginalized groups. This case illustrates, of course, from a negative perspective, the considerable impact subnational governments can have on national governance. It may appear that the Cherokee Nation was expelled by the federal government, but the real force behind it was Georgia. Since Native Americans lacked their representatives in the federal government, the Cherokee Nation effectively gave power to their enemy right from the beginning. The Cherokee Nation overlooked a crucial point. The U.S. federal government during that time was not a neutral entity separate from the states. It was shaped by them. The Cherokee Nation was appealing to a central government where it had no voting rights, while Georgia did. This situation shows that the core issue wasn't the conflict between the federal government and the regional governments, but rather the disputes among different regional governments. In the end, they lost to opponents who had control over the decision maker in the contest. Winning doesn't always mean justice, and even what justice means can be debated. Still, native or local people who want to protect their beliefs and interests must come together to avoid oppression by others using the general government. They should call on the others from different regions who share their beliefs and claims, raising their agenda to become national acts, constitutional laws, amendments, or even a new constitution. In summary, both the United States and modern China shared the contingent nature of their general governments and the crucial role of regional breakthroughs within the polycentric constitutional tradition. A key factor in subnational political dynamics is whether one subnational entity can gain support from the others to advance common claims. Hawaii and Hunan could do this. Georgia could do as well, but the Cherokee Nation could not. That difference make a difference. In a polycentric structure, significant advances by subnational entities can drive systematic changes at both the regional and national levels. The collective action of these subnational polycentres often depends on the ongoing and pioneering breakthroughs of a leading one. So for citizens today who want to protect their beliefs and interests, a more effective approach, which we learn from the Hawaii and the Hunan cases, than just waiting for news from the capital through TV or social media is to think about a key question. What can people do in their own subnational constitutions to help drive national constitutional change? That's my presentation. Professor Booth, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ling, for that very interesting talk. I will now hand over the microphone to Professor Peterson, who will offer some comments.
Thank you very much. I really admire the efforts you're making to do comparative research. I'm going to suggest you stop sharing slides, and then we won't have the big black slide taking up most of the screen for our audience. If you can stop sharing, but I'll carry on with my comments. Comparative legal research is very challenging, and I do some comparative legal research, primarily on comparative implementation of international human rights norms and treaties in different jurisdictions. Whenever I start a comparative project, I'm always very careful about the jurisdictions I select, because my sense is that if you try to compare jurisdictions that are very, 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 very different, the comparison isn't necessarily going to be as meaningful or as helpful to promoting understanding. So, for example, a current project I'm working on compares the evolution of LGBT rights in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And the reason my co-author, Kelly Loper, and I chose those three jurisdictions is because they do have certain things in common. They're Chinese majority societies. They're all influenced to some extent by Confucian philosophy, but they have very different political systems, and international human rights law has a very different role to play in all three jurisdictions. So we feel there's enough similarity, but also some important differences so that we can make meaningful comparisons. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I think, in my opinion, the comparisons you've chosen may just be too different to really allow you to draw certain conclusions that you're drawing. So I'm going to focus my remarks on two comparisons that you're making. One is between the United States and China, as a legal system. And one, then if I have time, I'll make some brief comments on your comparison between the Hawaii Con and the Hunan Constitutional Convention. So to start with the comparison of US and China, you say in your paper, and I've had the benefit of reading your draft paper, which the audience I don't think has seen, but even on the slides, you say it seems that one of your main goals is to challenge this traditional view that China is a centralized unitary state. And you want to make the argument that it's more of a polycentric republic, similar to the US in certain ways. And I have to tell you, I'm not convinced by that. I think you would need more evidence to persuade me, at least, that China is not still a very centralized unitary state. And I say that partly because, on one hand, it's true that the US federal government has acquired a great deal more power over the decades. And that's partly because of Congress's use of the spending clause to justify passing more federal legislation, and also the expansion in interstate commerce. And so the federal government can pass more legislation than it was able to do in the early days. But that being said, there are still limits, enforceable limits, on the federal lawmaking power in the United States. And I don't see that in China. And examples in the US, for example, the Violence Against Women Act was challenged on the grounds that it exceeded the federal government's lawmaking powers. And although some parts of the Violence Against Women Act did survive constitutional scrutiny, some did not. There are limits to what the federal Congress can do. And even when it comes to implementing treaties, we see limits in practice, because although in theory, the federal government is responsible for complying with our international obligations, in practice, what happens is that whenever the US Senate gives its advice and consent to ratify a human rights treaty, they put in a declaration that says it's a non-self-executing treaty, which then means the courts cannot directly enforce it. And senators from conservative states have been very jealous in guarding states' rights and making sure that international human rights norms are not used to erode state sovereignty over certain issues. That is one of the reasons that it's very difficult to even get 2/3 of a Senate majority to ratify human rights treaties. That's why China has ratified more human rights treaties than the United States. It's because in China, the central government can decide if it wants to ratify a human rights treaty, it does so. In the United States, if the president decides to sign a human rights treaty, president still needs to get 2/3 of the Senate to give its advice and consent before the president completes the ratification process. And so we have many human rights treaties, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, even the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that have been signed by our president but never ratified because the Senate wouldn't give its advice and consent. And if you listen to the debates in the US Senate, it's often about preserving states' rights. They're very concerned that ratifying that treaty would give the federal government more power to tell the states what to do. So I think that I do question whether it makes sense to compare the United States, where yes, the federal government has acquired more power, but there are still enforceable limits on the federal government's power. And the states do have certain areas of responsibility that are really the state's responsibilities, and they're not just delegated powers, right? Whereas in China, certainly most traditional constitutional scholars in China will say that any powers that the provinces have could be taken away by the central government because they're essentially delegated. And one thing that kind of surprised me about your paper is that I don't think you ever mentioned Hong Kong. And I'm curious as to why, and I'm certainly give you a chance to explain why. But the reason I think you would want to look at Hong Kong is that if there's ever a part of China that one could argue is perhaps more comparable to the federal-state relationship in the US, one might say that it's Hong Kong and China. Because under one country, two systems, which, as we know, was originally proposed for Taiwan, in theory, Hong Kong is supposed to have a very high degree of autonomy. And if you read the Sino-British Joint Declaration, the bilateral treaty that set the terms for Hong Kong's transition, and if you read the Hong Kong Basic Law, which is the regional constitutional instrument for Hong Kong, it gives almost all of the lawmaking power to Hong Kong. But the central government was very careful, and they insisted on keeping the power to interpret the Basic Law with Beijing. And as a result, whenever there really has been a significant clash of interests and desires, such as the democracy movement, for example, Beijing has not hesitated to use its power to interpret the Basic Law to make sure Hong Kong does what it wants. And so I think, in a way, the mainland scholars who insisted that Hong Kong was not akin to a federal arrangement were right. I mean, I remember in the early days of One Country, Two Systems, because I was teaching Hong Kong constitutional law at the time, there were people who argued that One Country, Two Systems could be compared to federalism because there were certain areas of lawmaking that were clearly left to Hong Kong. And there were people that argued that Hong Kong had greater autonomy than a US state under the US federal model, because Hong Kong actually has arguably a form of international legal personality, in that Hong Kong has its own membership in the World Trade Organization. It has can form international agreements with other countries. For example, Hong Kong had extradition agreements with countries that would not enter into extradition agreements with mainland China. Most of those agreements have been suspended now because of the national security law. But there was a time when people were arguing that Hong Kong had even greater autonomy than a state in a federal system. But I always remember many influential mainland Chinese scholars saying, no, no, you're wrong. It's all delegated power. The basic law was enacted by the National People's Congress. It will be interpreted by the NPC Standing Committee. Whatever power Hong Kong enjoys is delegated and can be taken away. And I think that what's happened since 2020 illustrates that they were probably right. So I guess I think that it's important to think about the difference between allocation of powers in practice, what happens in practice, and allocation of powers in times when there is a clash. Because as long as the provinces, the provincial governments are doing things that Beijing is happy with, and that's one thing. If Hong Kong had exercised its high degree of autonomy in a way that made Beijing happy, I suspect we would not have had the national security law, right? But the Hong Kong people were insistent on expanding democracy, on getting the right to elect their chief executive, having a fully elected legislative council, and that ran right into Beijing's core interests. And when that happened, Beijing exercised the powers that it had. That's not true in the United States, because in the United States, there are many, many examples where states have exercised their powers in ways that really clashed with the federal government's interest at the time, and yet the state's autonomy did prevail. And a good example, which I always teach in my international law course, is the fact that, you know, the United States has been sued many times because sometimes our state law enforcement officials are not so good about giving people who have been arrested the right to consular access. And you may know of some of those cases that have gone to the International Court of Justice, where the International Court of Justice has ordered the United States to give a criminal defendant a new trial because that criminal defendant did not have the opportunity to contact their consul before the trial. And the argument would be that they are disadvantaged by that. Well, many states have procedural rules that prevent people from bringing up an argument like this after the conviction, and the procedural default rule. And we've had clashes over that, where the federal government has asked state governments to give someone a new trial so that the US would not be out of sync with its obligations under international law. And some states have said yes, and some states have said no. So, you know, Texas said no. Even when President Bush Jr. asked Texas to give Medellin a new trial, they said, no, not going to do it. Procedural default rule. Sorry. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, non-self-executing treaty, we're not going to enforce it. So Texas, you're embarrassing the United States. You're putting the United States in a position where we are not complying with our obligations under an international treaty, but there's nothing the US Supreme Court will do to force Texas to do that. Why are all these treaties non-self-executing? Sometimes the Senate actually says that when they ratify, but sometimes the Supreme Court just interprets the treaty as being non-self-executing. And often it has the effect of protecting the state's autonomy, right? So these are just a few things for you to think about, but in my opinion, it is just too different. There's a huge difference between autonomy that might be practiced because it's politically acceptable or it works to the central government's advantage, and autonomy that can be practiced as right and will be enforced in the courts. then I want to leave time for questions. So I won't say as much about the Hawaii Kankan Hunan comparison, but I did question your reference when you were comparing the impact of the Hawaii Kankan. You were saying the Hawaii Kankan had a lot of impact on indigenous rights in the United States. And this is not my area of expertise, but I do question how much it has influenced the protection of indigenous rights in other parts of the United States, because in other parts of the United States and the continent, we do have tribal self-government. I mean, the Native American tribal governments are sovereign, self-governing entities. You refer to them in your paper as domestic dependent nations. I'm not sure the Cherokee Nation would agree with you anymore on that. I mean, you say the Cherokee Nation failed, but if you go on the website of the Cherokee Nation, I'd say now they're functioning very much as a sovereign entity, and they really aren't part of a state governmental system. So I'm not sure that they would feel the need to try to copy what was done in Hawaii, in the Hawaii Kankan, in the states, because they are really separate from the states. And that's where Hawaii differs from the model that has been used on the continent. So I think it might be kind of important to update that aspect of your research, because I could be wrong, but I didn't see any citations for this, what I think is a main assertion that you're making, which is that the Hawaii Kankan has really influenced indigenous rights throughout the United States. Maybe it has. I could be wrong about that. But I think that you need to acknowledge the sovereignty of the tribal governments on the continent. And I think also it's important to note, at least, that there was a proposal to do something similar with respect to Hawaii, and that was known as the Akaka Bill. It was named after Senator Akaka, who was essentially proposing that Native Hawaiians should enjoy a similar self-governance model to that enjoyed by Native Americans on the continent. And that did not pass. But the fact that it was even proposed makes me think that you should be discussing that in your paper if you really do want to make that comparison between, Hawaii, the Hawaii Kankan and the Hunan Kankan, especially if you're going to make that statement that Hawaii has greatly influenced indigenous rights throughout the rest of the United States. I'm honestly just not sure. So I will close with that because I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments from the audience. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Peterson. Professor Ling, would like to respond to those comments? Right now, we have one question in the Q&A that I can read to you afterwards.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Peterson for your wonderful and critical comments. And I think it's really a academical conversation that I really want. But I would like to say, since there's so many talks about the difference between the United States and China, I think we do need more people to talk about to compare this these two nations in a more similar way. And I think the basic issue is I did not use this federalist approach to understand federalism. So when people talk about federalism, especially the American federalism, actually people use the federalist approach to understand that. I think I would like to try another view, another perspective I call the polycentrism. So we can understand what Professor Peterson emphasized. And we can see you still use a federalist approach. So states government and the federal government. So when people use the federalist approach to think about the federalism, actually people are more centralized. You take the capital, the general or federal government at the center and think about everything have to decided by the center. And for example, for the international treaty, so if the central government, the federal government won't let it pass, then the United States cannot accept this treaty. However, if we change our view, if we change our approach to this issue, we can see actually states can do everything. You can pass a state law, you can change your state's constitution to accept something. And you even can promote litigations cases to challenge the federal Supreme Court. So there's a big room. And so I take different approach. I think each country, not only for the United States, but for China as well, I call the subnational or regional governments can do many things, can do more things than we think about that. And I give two historical examples, but actually even now, even today, in the two countries, the subnational entities do many things. We just don't look at them. We always focus on the central government, focus on Beijing, focus on Washington, D.C. So we talk about everything about that. It seems that if Beijing or Washington, D.C. didn't agree with anything, then they won't anything. But actually, for the Chinese provincial governments, the local governments, they have a very broad legislative powers. They regulate, they decide many things. So the Hunan Kangkang gave an example that the state can even change the the basic constitutional structure. They can establish the local systems by themselves. And the central government finally accepted. And even now we have the same structure. So I think for the United States, it's the same case. So think about that. If Hawaiian people, if you don't want Trump administration again, you cannot wait let Texas or the other state decide it. You cannot just let the Supreme Court decide it. So you cannot wait until the other states who control the central government. So if
I could respond quickly.
Yeah,
I mean, I fully agree. I fully agree with you when you say the states can do more if they want. I agree. I don't disagree with that at all. And in fact, when it comes to some human rights treaties, such as the CEDAW Convention, there's a City for CEDAWs movement where cities in the United States are signing on to CEDAW, and they can implement the goals of CEDAW if they want at their local or state level, if they have the political support to do so. What they cannot do is participate in the international human rights treaty monitoring process, because at the international level, the UN human rights treaty bodies, they recognize one representative, which is why even though Taiwan has actually incorporated a number of important human rights treaties into their domestic legal system, they cannot report to the treaty monitoring bodies because they're not a member of the UN and they cannot send representatives. So I think the point I'm trying to make is not that the federal government is controlling everything, but rather states do control a great deal in the United States, and they can provide a higher level of freedom and human rights or a lower level than the federal government would want in many cases. Not always. It depends on the scenario and how the federal government has made use of its lawmaking powers under the spending clause and the interstate commerce clause. So I don't disagree with your idea of looking at polycentric as opposed to federal state. I think that makes sense. I just think that one has to be very careful about what examples you choose, because I don't think it teaches us as much unless you're looking at areas where the central government and the local, regional, state, whatever you want to call it, provincial, where their interests clash. I think that's where one has to focus to see whether really the power relationship is decentralized. And that's why I brought up Hong Kong, because I think once the interests clash, that's when the true nature of the power relationship, which in the end really was much more delegated authority than actual power at the local level. That's my point, that I think you have to look at examples where there are clash in interests to see. And I don't know enough about what's happening at the provincial level to know whether in fact the provinces are exercising real power in those situations where the interests and long-term goals might actually clash.
Yeah, I understand, and I think yeah, you talk about the division of power. So according to the division of power between the federal or central government and the local or regional governments, there's a difference. There are a lot of differences, of course, and I think each country has its own limitation, its own line between central governments and the local governments.
Right. I'm going to interrupt you just because we're close to that time, and I think there are some questions. I probably took up too much time. Sorry.
No. I don't see. Yeah, but I think if there's yeah, Professor Booth, if there's another one who would like to join our conversation, yeah.
Yeah, we have a couple of minutes here. I know Ming Bao wants to basically pull things back together. In the chat room, there's one question. I don't know if you saw that. Do you want me to read it to you, or do you want to have a look at that?
It's under Q&A, not chat.
I'm sorry, under Q&A.
Mm.
Talking about the warlord period in China in the 20s and 30s, when I can read it to you. It says during the 20s and 30s, China did.
Q&A, I see. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I see. I think the question is when China is disunion is divided, was divided. So and the military warlords can use their local powers to do something. So the potential issue is when China is united, now whether the local governments can do anything. I think of course. So if you look at the Chinese constitution, if you look at the Chinese legislations, there's huge provincial legislations. So when people use centralized perspective to see China, when people only see Beijing, yes, you can see Beijing govern everything. But however, if you go the other places, you to see Shanghai, to see Nanjing, to see Wuhan, to see Guangzhou, to see what I called revolutionary constitutional centers, I think you can see there's a lot of things. They have legislative powers, they make decisions. Of course, theoretically, the central government have this power to decide the line between the local governments and the central governments. I did not try to say that the unitary system is totally similar to the federalism. No, I don't see that. We
Okay.
can see the difference between federalism and the unitary system, as especially Professor Peterson emphasized and make it this statement more clear. And but still, there's another perspective. What I want to emphasize is that I did not want to challenge the conventional wisdom that there's a difference between the unitary system and the federal system. Of course, it is. However, we still can have another perspective, what I called monocentrism and polycentrism. So if you look at the two countries from this perspective, you can see the United States is a polycentric federalism, and China is a polycentric unitary system. So it can be unitary, but still polycentric. Because both countries are great power, have huge populations, huge territories, and the central government just cannot decide everything. And of course, the local people, the different regional people cannot just wait for the central government to decide everything. And essentially, I think the most important thing is that in a polycentric tradition, that's what I want to emphasize, that the central government or federal government is contingent, it's neutral. That means it is decided, not decisive. For example, who is the central government? There's no permanent central government. So it is decided by which states, which provinces have more influences on the central government. For example, I think the United States give a clear example that now the swimming states will decide the future for the country. But why let so few states to decide the whole country's future? Because it is polycentric. So that's a key issue. That's a mechanism. So I call it power distribution. It's different. It's more fundamental than power division. I think Professor Peterson remind us we should not forget there's a big difference in the division of power. And I totally agree, and I respect this reminder. But what I want to add another perspective into our understanding that we may look at from a perspective power distribution, those countries, and then we can get different images.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ling. And unfortunately, I hate to cut in, but we're running out of time. And I was going to announce our next CCS webinar, but I put the information in the chat form, so please look at that. So to conclude our session today, please join me in a round of applause. You can, clap in the reaction. You can tap on that. To thank Professor Lingbing for his wonderful presentation. It was very informative. To our moderator, Professor Charles Booth, and to our discussant, Professor Carol Peterson, for her insightful comments and for this thought-provoking dialogue. We obviously could go on for another hour, but unfortunately, we don't have the time. Many thanks as well to our audience for your attendance, to comments and questions. And please remember to fill out the short survey. And until our next webinar on October 9th, please have a good day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Thank you, Carol. Thank you,
Thank
Charles.
you.
This
It's
was
very
great.
interesting.
Such a provocative topic,
Enjoyed the
right?
dialogue there, really
Yes,
did.
the dialogue was
Discussion,
fantastic.
yeah.
So
Okay.
I
Can
think
we
have
do
to
a
stop
screenshot
recording.
with everyone? Can
We
we do a
screenshot
screenshot with
here,
everyone?
Dee?
Oh,
Can we do a screenshot before we go?
okay. And Jesse can stop recording. Did you do that?
Yeah.
Nee?
Yeah. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very
For
much.
your organizing
Thank you very
skills.
much.
Bye.